Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. The best-selling author of America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It, Mark Steyn, publishes regularly in National Review, The Washington Times, Investor's Business Daily, and in venues in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and is a frequent guest host for Rush Limbaugh. Hollywood writer and producer Rob Long started his career as a screenwriter for the hit television show Cheers. He writes a regular column for National Review magazine and records a weekly radio spot, Martini Shot, for KCRW in Los Angeles. Mr. Long is editor-in-chief of Ricochet.com, a center-right website that will launch this spring and in which Mr. Steyn is also participating. Welcome, gentlemen.
Can we say that you're also part of Ricochet.com, or is that
full disclosure? Full disclosure. You may say it. You may say it.
All right.
Segment 1, the Gipper, Then and Now. On October 27th, 1964, 1 week before the presidential election, Ronald Reagan delivered a speech on national television on behalf of presidential candidate Senator Barry Goldwater, the Republican. President Johnson 1 week later buried Barry Goldwater in one of the biggest landslides in American history. But 2 years later, Ronald Reagan would be elected governor of California, and 16 years later as president of the United States. Ronald Reagan in 1964.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. Not too long ago, 2 friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man.
Rob Long, grade that.
He's pretty good. It's amazing. Well, first of all, what's interesting is how quickly he speaks. He's actually doing, he slowed down, and I think slowing down was probably a better choice as he went on, because there's a lot of ideas packed in there. And I can't help but be depressed to think 36 years ago, they were talking about Castro. 36 years later, we're still talking about Castro. So part of me is sort of astonished that a lot of these things are so incredibly relevant and happening today. But another part of me thinks, you know, this guy really knew how to deliver a message. And I think in this case, obviously, Goldwater didn't fare so well a week later, but in this case, the message was, I'm a leader. I'm a real leader.
Mark, I heard that and I was so struck. Of course, what he's talking about when he talks about the worst enemy that mankind has faced in the long ascent from the swamp, of course what he's talking about is Soviet communism. But I was so struck after rereading America Alone at how easily you can pick up the argument and drop it right down into the current circumstance. Yes?
Yeah, I think that's because it's really not about whatever you're talking about. It's never really about the enemy. It's always about us. That's to say, free, prosperous societies always have existential enemies. But what determines whether they triumph or not is not them, but us. And when he tells his story about the Cuban saying, "You don't know how lucky," the American says, we don't know how lucky we are, and the Cuban says, "You don't know how lucky I am. I had somewhere to go to. I'm not in the Cuban situation, but I came here and
Canada,
well, same healthcare system,
exactly,
except with a lower doctor-patient ratio. But as
weather differences.
That's right. But as Reagan says, this is the last stand. I felt that. To be honest, I felt that after the 2008 election. I felt, wow, I finally got off the boat at Ellis Island, and I'm reading the base of the statue, and they're saying, "Give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. Oh, and by the way, if you've just got in from the old country, we're now reintroducing serfdom." And I think that is really the problem for those of us who've come here as immigrants, is we're seeing all the same mistakes that have been tried in Canada and Europe, and in Reagan's words, if this is the last stand, if the Cuban guy has somewhere to go to, where does anyone go now? You know, I saw one of your colleagues. I can't remember one of these Hollywood, one of these
One of
Hollywood,
them.
one of these
One of yours.
one of these Hollywood actors.
I apologize in advance.
One of these big A-list celebrities years ago, and he was on this Bill Maher's show, and he's listening to some left-wing guy absent-mindedly nodding through everything the left-wing guy says, and then goes, well, wait a minute. The reality of it suddenly dawns on him, and he goes, well, wait a minute. If you do all that, where are the rest of us going to move to? And the Hollywood guy, it eventually dawned even on the Hollywood guy that this is the last stand.
This is the last stand. Yeah, you've arrived someplace and we've changed the brochure.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a little different now.
Product not as advertised.
Right, exactly.
So what do you make of that phrase, the last stand on earth, the story about the Cuban saying I had someplace to escape to? The point, I say this as a former Reagan speechwriter, he wrote that himself.
Oh, he was a great writer. I mean, you can see it in the letters he wrote by hand, and you can see his little tiny old man little pencil scratchings on the speeches that they sometimes put on display at the library.
This is needless to say, a self-serving question to ask a table of writers, but is it not the case that he got where he was by exerting his mind on the issues of the day through the medium of a pen on paper? There really is no way to learn your own mind, except by writing. Wouldn't you too?
Well, that's
agree?
an old phrase people have said. How do I know what I think until I see what I write?
Right.
But I have a feeling that Ronald Reagan always knew what he thought. That was part of the power of his delivery. He really, really knew what he thought. You know, the most amazing thing is you watch that sort of grainy black and white footage, and this is a very old man, now dead, is speaking, and he seems to be talking on the face of it about a world in black and white. I mean, really a world that doesn't even exist anymore. And all you can think of is, my God, he's actually talking about today. And he was considered he's considered an artifact now. You're like, oh well, you know, the Cold War is over.
Right.
We're without the Cold War, without the giant polarities to sort of organize the globe. Where is the right wing going to go? Where is America going to be without a great enemy?
I have to
and
say, when I heard that, I'd forgotten. It's been years since I looked at this, and I felt there, black and white. If he were still alive, he'd be 100 next year. I agree. It feels like a different world, and yet it was as though he reached out and took me by the tie and said, "This still."
Not by the tie either, by the way.
You know what it is? He's the opposite of what everyone said about him at the time. In 1980. When he ran for office, the standard joke was that he was the airheaded B-movie actor, the front man, who just said the words that people like you put in his mouth. In fact, nobody in modern American history has thought longer or harder about a coherent philosophical worldview than Ronald Reagan. And he did it in speeches like that. He'd been doing it for 15 years previously in all the stuff he was doing in the 50s. And I think that's the difference between him and a John McCain or many other of the candidates, or the Bob Dole, all kinds of other fellas we wind up with on the ticket.
Segment 2, Reagan on government control of healthcare. In 1961...
Let me think. Let me see if we can predict his thoughts.
Yes. In 1961, the American Medical Association put together a public relations campaign to oppose legislation that would have required the federal government to pay for medical care for all those eligible to receive Social Security. In those days, note, the AMA was against it. One of the AMA's measures to distribute an album, an LP, remember those? Things like this that we put on objects called record players, called Ronald Reagan Speaks Out Against Socialized Medicine. No video this time, just audio.
One of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism on a people has been by way of medicine. The doctor begins to lose freedoms. It's like telling a lie, and one leads to another. So a doctor decides he wants to practice in one town, and the government has to say to him, you can't live in that town. They already have enough doctors. You have to go someplace else. And from here it's only a short step to dictating where he will go. All of us can see what happens once you establish the precedent that the government can determine a man's working place and his working methods, determine his employment.
Mark Steyn?
That's a much better LP than Sgt. Pepper. He's right. Everything that people think sounds ridiculous actually happens in countries with government healthcare systems. He's quite right. In the province of Quebec, for example, they tell doctors, no, you can't practice in Montreal. You got to go and practice up in Lac Saint Jean, a few hours north, because they need a doctor there. He rightly identified, I think, what is at issue here, which is that once the government is responsible for your health care, it licenses the government to regulate every aspect of your life, because everything's to do. What you eat impacts on your health. That's the argument that was made about seatbelts and motorcycle helmets, that if you fall off your motorcycle and you're not wearing a helmet, you'll have to be patched up in hospital at government expense. Therefore, the government has the right to tell you have to wear a helmet. Now we see that in Britain, where they have health inspectors coming around to inspect the contents of your fridge, they've got cameras not just to detect your speed on the highways, but that close in to see whether you're eating a sandwich in your car.
But not what the sandwich is made of, though, right? Not yet.
No, they can't. They can't.
Right.
They can't detect yet whether it's a ham and rye, hold the mustard, but they can detect that it's a sandwich. Because once you've got government healthcare, that gives the government the right to regulate everything else in your life, and he saw that.
Why does no one sound like that anymore?
I think nobody people. First of all, people are embarrassed now. That's sort of more ironic and hip. Ronald Reagan was never embarrassed to be against socialism. I mean, he used the word. Now people say, well, it sounds, if you're a sophisticated, right-thinking person, you want to, at a fancy dinner party, you say, well, of course I would never use some rude word like socialism or communism. But it does seem a little big government, was what we say when we're against it. He called it what it was. I mean, just to follow up on what Marx says, when you create a government and a culture that expects the government to take care of all of the big stuff, your health, your education, your housing, then what do you spend your money on? Toys.
Flat screen television.
Yeah, flat screens. You are literally infantilized. Your salary is literally now your allowance. And dad and mom take care of everything else.
Mark, you've said elsewhere in discussing Obamacare that you think many Republicans made a mistake by arguing against it on utilitarian grounds. It won't work, it'll have bad effects on Medicare, and they missed the liberty argument. And that's what Ronald Reagan goes for directly here in 1961, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is an assault on your freedom.
Yeah,
and that's why it's wrong.
And I like the way he talked. In liberty terms. I think conservatives make a mistake sometimes when they talk about big government and we're for small government. Because when you're for the small thing, you sound like you're for the mean, shriveled, grudging little thing. And I don't think it's really an argument about big government versus small government. It's about big freedom versus little freedom. Big government expands at the cost of individual liberty. And that's why the left is always on the lookout for pretexts to regulate your life. Healthcare is a good example. The environment is a good example, because if you've got environmental regulation, what isn't in the environment? What this table's made of is part of the environment. The air that we breathe is part of the environment.
Right. Segment 3, the Constitution and the masses. Back now to Reagan's 1964 address. In the excerpt that we're about to hear, Reagan refers to a speech given here at Stanford, where we're recording this, by Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas. You remember J. William Fulbright. Do you, Rob? Or did
I know the name. It's vague. As you know, I'm quite young.
Okay, and then Reagan also quotes Senator Joseph Clark of Pennsylvania. Ronald Reagan in 1964.
Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded. He referred to the president as our moral teacher and our leader. And he says he is hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document. He must be freed so that he can do for us what he knows is best. And Senator Clark of Pennsylvania, another articulate spokesman, defines liberalism as meeting the material needs of the masses through the full power of centralized government. Well, I, for one, resent it when a representative of the people refers to you and me, the free men and women of this country, as the masses.
Amen.
Amen.
I mean, why can't you? This is terrific stuff, Rob. I mean,
it's my fault now.
No. But why can't we do like that Avatar thing? Why can't we get some computer-generated animatronic figure and get him on the road saying that kind of stuff right now? Because I wish there was a guy who put it in those terms right now.
First of all, he dresses just like he's like Mad Men. Have you seen this show?
Oh yes, that's right.
He looks he's right out of Mad Men. It's fantastic. But, it's fantastic. I mean, it really seems incredibly contemporary.
J. William Fulbright, the president, Fulbright was talking about Lyndon Johnson. But does this not sound as though it encapsulates a certain attitude? The President of the United States is our moral teacher and our leader.
Oh, I know, it's ludicrous. But what's interesting, I mean, just from perspective of 2010.
Does not Barack Obama come to mind?
Yes, I think so.
All right,
absolutely. But I think what's even more shocking, when you hear that, if you're a contemporary sort of American, you hear that, you think, well, this is a little bit too much, isn't it? I mean, what's really going to happen? But if you were 19, from the perspective of early 1960s, 15 years before, Europe was in the grip of fascism, where people were, the leaders were the moral teachers. I mean, 15 years ago was 1995. That's actually quite recent. 15 years before he gave that speech, well, Franco was still in power. There was still a dictator in Portugal. There was a dictator, a moral leader and father in the fatherland in the Thousand-Year Reich in Germany. I mean, the idea was that these things really could happen. Civilized nations could go south.
I hereby unleash you on our friend Rob Long to dispute the notion that these days that's a little bit too much, that you really have to cast your mind back from 2010 to about 1944 in order for Ronald Reagan to sound reasonable.
Well, no, but no. To put it in its more benign terms, I think what is fascinating to me about the Obama age and about what Senator Fulbright was saying is what you might call the persistence of the monarchical urge 2 1/3 centuries after George III was given the boot, is that there is a lot of people do want a strong, charismatic leader who knows what's best for you. I don't. I like citizen legislators, and I don't regard the President of the United States as my leader. I don't regard, never mind regarding Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi as my leaders.
They're not your spiritual leaders that you look to of a Sunday afternoon for. That's exactly right. He's the chief executive of the administrative branch of government, and that's it.
Yeah.
And this idea, I always thought the best thing that George W. Bush could do after relaxing for a little bit on his ranch, maybe playing with the dogs, is run for Congress. And be the congressman from Crawford, Texas, and teach everyone, like John Quincy Adams, teach everyone that you are not a...
Or Andrew Johnson.
Yeah. Really? He was a...
Didn't Andrew Johnson
not after
impeachment? I thought he didn't.
Did he? All right.
Good Lord, we've been schooled in American history by a mere immigrant.
Well, I might just be winging it.
Send your emails
I think it's
to
question 37 on the citizenship
exactly
test,
right.
if you want to heads up.
Rob, this notion that Reagan is saying these liberals are chafing at this sacred document, the Constitution of the United States, 1964. Rick Hertzberg, just a few months ago, writing in the New Yorker, quote, he writes of, quote, the obsolescence of our 18th century political and electoral hydraulics, such as the separation of powers, and the lack of a single government accountable to a national electorate, so much for the Constitution. This impulse to find the Constitution a binding document rather than to respect the ordered and the checks and balances, that's still in liberalism today, is it not?
Well, sure, it's a great Rorschach test, because if you find the Constitution binding and too restrictive, it just makes me all the more grateful we have a Constitution, right? Because if you're of the political mind that you think, well, this is a little too restrictive, I have other plans, then I'm certainly glad we have a Constitution. I think if you don't embrace the fact that you win some, you lose some, it's sort of chaotic. I mean, the document isn't fully formed, right? Lots of room for people to fight over it all the time, but it's sort of elastic and constricts at the same time. That to me is a good document.
Well, or the word that I don't know whether it was Fulbright or Clark, the word they used, our great leader is hobbled. Quote. Well, I think it's good.
Yeah,
I think Saddam Hussein could have done with more hobbling. I think Kim Jong-il would benefit from a certain amount of hobble. I think that's good.
Okay, now let me try one. This may be going to, even I grant that I may be going a little bit too far here, but Reagan resenting Senator Clark of Pennsylvania, referring to the American people as the masses. Okay, So I think of Barack Obama's acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, where they had it outside in a stadium, and there was one tight shot. One person was recognizable as an actual human being. That was Barack Obama. Everybody else, there's these huge shots of the stadium in which everybody else was it was very different from typical American convention coverage, where the halls are small, you can see people in front, you can see the actual delegations. And then on Inauguration Day, I'm trying.
Yeah.
Inauguration, if you grimace, I'll go to Mark with this one.
I know.
So on Inauguration Day, when the crowds were chanting, Obama, Obama, that was too much, no? Un-American a little bit?
Well, in retrospect, it seems silly. It seems like this kind of wild drunkenness. I don't know about perhaps the inauguration speech, I accept a little bit your point. In the convention speech, whoever they pan to from conventions, since they've been televised, is some absurd-looking person in a crazy hat. Yeah. So it isn't as if you're sort of an elevated citizen there. Look at the citizen legislator here.
No, but it's a distinct human being.
People are not human being in a crazy hat.
See, he says I'm
on human being in an insane hat.
Yeah, that's all right.
Even if he's not in the hat, if he's just like a guy in a stained seersucker suit, he's an individual. And this is the first time where I agree with Reagan. I don't think we should be referring to people as quote the masses, unquote, under the great leader. And I think there was far too much of that in the whole Obama thing. That pledge video that a bunch of celebrities made. I hate to keep beating up on Hollywood, but which
you don't.
Ashton Kutcher made.
I pledged. It was almost like it was.
Yeah, I pledge myself to be a servant of my president and mankind. Well, include me out. Sorry,
right.
That's that. I'm not a. There are 300 million individuals in this country, and this idea that there are amorphous, shapeless masses. And it's not. I'm not saying.
Nonsense.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's a Nuremberg thing. But what it is it's like an Ivy League technocratic thing. That's what we have now, which in a way is worse. It's more annoying than the guys in the wacky shorts goose stepping down the street, because at least you get a bit of kind of crude theater with that. But what we have here now is just like a technocratic elite deciding that the masses are too stupid to get through life without having things like healthcare and whatever organized for them.
They're not even on a mission; they're just smug.
Right.
Yeah.
But also, they're sort of they're firemen. You know, there's always that talk of the healthcare forum that when Nancy Pelosi took over the House in 2007, I guess when she was sworn in, this kind of idea that it's for the kids. People are dying. You don't understand. We're here to help the kids in death, and we're here to help. And this sort of insane idea that, my God, if left to our own devices, we'd all just die and wither if we didn't have Harry Reid and Barack Obama to sort of give us things. Because otherwise, good Lord, how can we make a decision on what doctor to go to?
Segment 4, Fatty and Skinny. Once again, Ronald Reagan in 1964.
We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one. So they're going to solve all the problems of human misery through government and government planning. Well, now, if government planning and welfare had the answer, and they've had almost 30 years of it, shouldn't we expect government to read the score to us once in a while? Shouldn't they be telling us about the decline each year in the number of people needing help, the reduction in the need for public housing? But the reverse is true. Each year, the need grows greater, the program grows greater.
Robert?
The guy's great. He should be the leader of the Tea Party movement. Certainly what it sounds like to me. It's also sort of it's magnificent to see this old stuff, because it just brings up so many associations. I mean, had you gone back then and said to that group of people that after 40 more years, 50 more years of government beneficence and welfare state, poor people in the United States would be obese, right? We're so rich and blessed in the United States, our poor people are fat. They have type 2 diabetes. They're dying of heart disease. I think these people would have thought you were insane. I mean, poverty was supposed to be, the fat guy was rich and the thin guy was poor, and that was that.
Mark, government spending in 1911, as the year Ronald Reagan was born, 9% of GDP. Government spending in 2011, next year, the year we'll be celebrating his centenary, 44% of GDP. What happened during that man's lifetime?
Well, I think it became possible to have big government. I think, for example, if you go back to when McKinley was assassinated, which was pretty much 100 years to the day before 9/11, People were upset because McKinley was assassinated. They thought he was a nice fella. He didn't deserve to be shot, but he didn't impinge on their life in a daily way, the way the modern president does. He dealt with foreign affairs. He was in Washington, but he wasn't a living presence in their lives. And I think we now have something. Tocqueville foresaw this. When we talk about absolute monarchs, in reality, an absolute monarch in medieval Europe, he may in theory dominate every aspect of your life, but he can't in practice. And so what it means is that, once every couple of years, some guy in velvet knickerbockers may ride into your barnyard and tell you you've got to pay a tax on this or a tax on that. But the rest of the time, you just get on with your life. In theory, he holds absolute power. In practice, he doesn't. What we have now, I think, is a situation where, imagine if they'd held the original Boston Tea Party and George III is sitting back in Buckingham Palace and he's going, hey, close up on that guy in the second row. Isn't that, what's his name?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, let's
check his tax returns.
Freeze his bank account.
Right.
And I think just technically it's possible to have big government now in a way that wasn't the case even as recently as McKinley's time.
And if you look at the chart of the growth of government, you get peaks during the First World War and the Second World War. But eliminate those peaks, and you still get a very smooth upward slope, which during Reagan's presidency flattens out, and then it resumes the climb. So the question there is this a cry that is essentially hopeless? Stop the growth of government, but we just can't.
Well, of course we can. I mean, I think that's a symptom of how rich we became so rich that really at a certain point we're arguing over a top tax rate that, we're a wealthy country, everybody's doing very well. It's really hard to make the case that we need to be more parsimonious. And somebody comes to you and says, look, let's simplify this thing. We'll just tax you but 2% more on your income, and you know what, you don't have to feel guilty anymore. Because we treat the government, our taxes, as a form of charitable contribution. So, well, I don't have to really worry about the poor in my neighborhood. I don't have to worry about the homeless. I don't have to worry about the orphans and the kids and all the things that, blue stockings used to go around and collect money for. We don't have to worry about that anymore because I pay my taxes. My government takes care of it.
We became so rich that liberals could assuage their guilt by paying higher taxes.
And so could conservatives.
The pity is that everybody gets caught in that. No.
Well, no, I think to modify that slightly, Rob, a guy wrote to me a couple of years ago when I was complaining about a lot of the stuff that President Reagan's complaining about. He goes, lighten up, man. We're rich enough to be able to afford to be stupid. Well, we discovered 2 years later we're not as rich as we were in 2008 when we're being a hell of a lot more stupid. And what is interesting about this is that the United States is really the last country to get on this bandwagon. Even in Scandinavia, for example, they realize that the state reaches a certain point and you can't push it any further. You've got to reel it back. So we're crossing, really, because the United States is expanding government at a time when certain countries that we think of as European socialist utopias are actually understanding that they've gone a stage too far and are having to pull back. And that's what's so pathetic. I mean, this is your big point that Obama is really like an old-fashioned guy. He's basically the Tony Orlando of politics. He's this 70s guy in his bell-bottom pants with these ancient policies.
So there's a dissertation in this answer, and we're taping effectively television, so you have to keep it brief. But here's the question.
Well, not really television, it's web.
Web, all right. It's a little more flexible.
Let's just call it what it is.
Right. So it hasn't been as focus grouped as your
No, exactly. That's right. People are watching on their phone.
He gives this speech. 16 years later, he becomes president. He cuts taxes. He holds the line on regulation. Government doesn't actually shrink, but the growth stops. And people like me who were working in his White House thought, wonderful. The country has learned. We as a democracy are capable of making decisions and learning what works. And now here we are at 2010, and the taxes are rising, and regulation is proliferating, and the size of government is metastasizing all over again. So what does that say about the American democracy? We're incapable of learning lessons.
Well, I think what it says is that these are eternal battles. You don't win. That's why everything he says sounds relevant today, because the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And in part because of what you think of where America would be if we'd had a second Carter term. I think we would have lost the Cold War. I mean, the Soviets were gobbling up real estate all over the world during the Carter term, including just offshore in Grenada. If we'd had a second term, the whole thing would be kaput. But instead, Reagan came in 1980, did great things. But 1980 is 30 years ago. So there are millions of middle-aged Americans who have absolutely. You can say Jimmy Carter, but they got no memory of Jimmy Carter.
Right. Segment 5, the last best hope. One final time, Ronald Reagan in 1964.
Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
What are we to make of that grace note? Rendezvous with history. He's quoting Franklin Roosevelt.
With destiny.
With destiny, excuse me. Rendezvous with destiny.
Well, he's quoting Franklin Roosevelt. He's quoting to an audience that remembers when it was said and remembers what it was said about. I mean, he's absolutely casting the current struggle against communism for him with the struggle against European fascism. And I think that's, for his audience, that was practically yesterday. I also think what's amazing about that speech is just how willing he was to be, I mean, for this optimistic, sunny, grandfatherly figure he was 16 years later, how willing he was to sort of say, we could lose.
This is it, we could lose.
This is it.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about this speech, is by the time he ran for president, there was a lot more light and shade. He was, by the time you were writing for him, there was a lot more sunniness and geniality in there. And when he says 1,000 years of darkness, I was thinking, whoa! I remember
Dials down.
I remember going to see Alan Keyes when he ran for president in 2000, and Alan Keyes' opening line was, "My friends, we stand on the brink of the abyss." And I was thinking,
let's clasp hands and jump.
Please give me your maximum allowable individual contribution. Yeah.
And I mean, it's great stuff, and Alan Keyes wasn't wrong, but I mean, I think Reagan got the balance, and all those jokes about being in Moscow and calling up to get the plumber to come round.
As president, he was much more reassuring.
Well,
this is going to work out.
Not just reassuring, but I think also he understood that the sort of lightness of touch is an important. But people want to feel that it isn't 1,000. If we risk 1,000 years of darkness, that there's a sporting chance we don't have to consign ourselves for that. And he used humour and light and shade much more effectively, I think. That's a terrific speech, but I liked all the plumbers' jokes 16 years later.
And the older you get, I think for him too, the older you get, you realize that this was a long struggle, and it really wasn't going to be settled by a presidential election in 1964.
By the way, evidence that what you're saying was recognized by Reagan himself. Bill Clark, Judge Clark, who was one of his closest advisors and almost like a son to Reagan, told me years later, after the White House years, that the timing worked out right for Ronald Reagan, because if he had been a presidential candidate in '64, he would have been too hot. Meaning the later to be president and his closest circle understood that as the years progressed. That quotation from Churchill that Reagan used, something, whether we like it or not, spells duty. Now, if we're right that speech remains relevant in some fundamental way today, then the question has to be asked, what does duty spell for our generation?
Well, I think you have a responsibility as a great power. The idea that you can be I respect the fact that America is a non-imperial superpower, but the idea that you can be a great power and just watch Dancing with the Stars and go to the mall is simply not practical. That a great power has to rise to the challenges history imposes on it. It doesn't have any choice in that, because it won't stay a great power for long, and it won't even stay free for long. I mean, this idea, the motto of my state, "Live free or die." The idea that is somehow a battle cry isn't. No, that's the reality of daily life. That if your society chooses not to live in freedom, it will, in the end, perish, and you get your old 1,000 years of darkness to take us back into Reagan Keyes territory.
Right. Rob, a couple of quotations here. Former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich in January 2008, quote, "We are at the end of the Reagan era," close quote. Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana, a participant in Ricochet, in April 2008, quote, "I hope very much not to be misunderstood. I think it is time to let Ronald Reagan go. Not from our reverent memory, of course, but as our touchstone, as our icon, as our hallmark, and our reference point," close quote. Governor Tim Pawlenty of Minnesota in March of this year, quote, "It would be as if Barack Obama was going around and constantly talking about Truman or LBJ. Reagan has just become a reference point that isn't as relevant for young people," close quote. Robert?
Well, you know, I have a great affection for Governor Daniels of Indiana. You know, he's my pick for next president if I can do anything about it.
You've said in public that you had a man crush
I do.
on
I think he's
Governor
fantastic.
Daniels.
I would say that that the Reagan we saw in flickering black and white is relevant and meaningful. And when he talks about duty, and I sort of agree with Mark that there's a sort of a general American duty to the world, but there's really an American duty, an American voter's duty to himself and herself and their family, and that's to give things up. That's to stop expecting these middle-class entitlements, to stop expecting government to take care of them, to stop voting themselves goodies. And that is a very hard duty, and that really will be the challenge of the next president, the next citizen. And the only way to do it is for us to stop asking for it. I mean, you see all these sort of people marching up and down the street in these tea parties. And what I hope happens is that they hear that and they recognize what the duty really is. And it's a duty to stop asking for things. It's a very, very hard thing to do. But that, to me, is the true American calling for the next 4, 8, 12 years.
Let Ronald Reagan go?
I would be prepared to let him go if there were still people around saying the kinds of things we just heard him say. I understand that there will be people who look at that and just don't get it because it's in black and white and he seems a bit severe and it's all like kind of a bit heavy man. I love Ronald Reagan's greatest hits have not been matched by any candidate since. I'm particularly fond of them. My favorite line is, "We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around."
First inaugural address, among other places.
Yeah, and a lot of places, you know, Canada is a government that has a nation a lot of the time. The European Union is a government that has 25 nations or whatever it is. That's an important line. And while I like Tim Pawlenty and Mitch Daniels and a lot of these other fellas, I don't hear them saying things like that. Now, I think you can retool those lines for 2010, just like... Rob's Hollywood colleagues will remake. Well, you were telling me that when you've got a problem, Rob told me a couple of months back there, and he says when he's got a problem on a script, he just steals from the Dick Van Dyke show.
Absolutely.
Now,
absolutely.
Now,
you never told our
now, if you put
black
that,
and white.
If you put that on TV now, there'd be Dick Van Dyke coming in from the office, and Mary Tyler Moore looking cute as hell. But people would say, "Well, it's black and white. Who are these people? I don't get it. My living room, it looks like it doesn't look right."
There's no ottoman trip over.
But but you would be you're absolutely right. You take what works and you put it in modern dress and you do it. You steal as craftily as Rob does, and nobody even spots you've stolen it. And I would like to see some guy in modern dress. He can be from the iPod generation, and he can be twittering himself all night, as far as I'm concerned. Did that come out right? I'm just trying to show him up to speed.
Yeah, as long as he doesn't frighten the horses, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
But I'd like to hear some of that. We're a nation that has a government, not the other way around.
Absolutely. Beat him.
Right. So as soon as we find a man or woman who can adapt our Dick Van Dyke to present circumstances, at that moment, we'll all hold a vote and let Ronald Reagan go.
Well, not go entirely. You need to keep him around, at least to keep people honest.
All right. Mark Steyn, Rob Long, thank you very much. For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson. Thanks for joining us.